Well, today I thought we'd look at John Calvin. John Calvin was born in 1509 in Noyon in France. Sadly, his mother died when he was young. His father, Gerard, who worked in the cathedral as a registrar notary, wanted his three sons to also go into church work, into the priesthood. So by the age of 12, Calvin was already working in the church, and then was sent off to study Latin and philosophy at Paris University. In 1525, Calvin's dad decided that that wasn't the right course of action, so he took him out of the university in Paris to make him study law in Orleans, apparently because that would be more lucrative. He'd make more money doing that. So he studied there for a while and then moved to the University of Bourges, where he underwent somewhat of a change. He says, this is his own words, his hard heart was made teachable, and he saw something of his need to salvation from a way of life that was leading him to eternal death. We don't know the exact date, but it's around that time that there's a real change in him. So he then returns to Paris in 1532 and becomes friends with a man called Nicholas Cop. He's actually the rector of the university, and he believed, he'd been influenced by Martin Luther and others, that the church needed reformation. It needed to change, it needed to be reformed. And Nicholas Cop dared to say this publicly, and this brought him no end of trouble. In the end, he had to flee from Paris to Basel in Switzerland. Calvin got caught up in all of that trouble, and he himself had to hide away for about a year, travelling around until it became so dangerous in the country. He left and joined Nicholas Cop in Basel. It's now 1536. Calvin is 27 years old, and he's been writing other things, but this is the first time he produces his first edition of his most famous work, called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. It's a sort of book of theology intended to defend the Reformation understanding of the Bible. It was also used as a textbook to teach, the intention was to teach newcomers to Christianity. It wasn't long before Calvin left Basel and went to work for a while in Italy for Princess Renee. But that didn't last very long, and it was a short appointment. He headed north again to Strasbourg. On the way, he had to stop off in Geneva for various reasons, and while he was there, he met another French reformer called Farel. Farel persuaded him to stay, and within a year, he is made a pastor of the church in Geneva. But sadly, Geneva wasn't ready for some of the reforms that Farel and Calvin wanted to bring in, and it all ended with pretty strenuous opposition to them. The two of them had to leave the city, and they headed to Zurich. And the reason they went to Zurich was to attend a synod, a gathering of church leaders designed to sort out these kind of problem issues. The hope was that things would be restored and they could go back, but Geneva refused to admit them back into the city. Farel eventually ended up in Germany, and Calvin in Strasbourg, which he was, when he got there, was invited again to take a lead in church life. And while he was there in Strasbourg, Calvin worked on the second edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion. Changing the format, it was no longer a sort of a question-answer kind of format. It was much more like the institutes that we know today. He was also at the time working on a commentary on Romans. Now, during that time, he made it known to his friends that he wanted to get married, and a friend of his called Martin Bucer, another reformer from Strasbourg, introduced him to Isolette de Burgh, and they married in August 1540. Together, she was a widow. She already had two children, but they had a number of children, but sadly all of them died while they were very young. And just a month after his marriage to Isolette, the city of Geneva got themselves into theological trouble, and they needed somebody to help. They needed somebody to lead the churches and help them give an answer to a problem that they had. And so they tried to find a way to get Calvin back. At first he was pretty reluctant, saying he'd rather die than go back, but September 1541, he's in a wagon with his family on his way back to the city of Geneva. Now, once in Geneva, work on reforming the church and the city began in earnest, and soon rules and regulations were put in place that included all sorts of directions about the way the church was run and who did what in the church, the role of pastors and elders and doctors, which they meant teachers by that, and then deacons, how they each had their different responsibilities. During that time, Calvin preached thousands of sermons. Initially, he was preaching 3 times a week plus twice on the Sunday. It became evident that was too much, and so that workload was reduced. But still, his pattern of regular, systematic exposition of the Bible, going through the books of the Bible, was maintained. And he maintained that for years and years in Geneva. Idelette, his wife, became ill in 1545 and then died in the early part of 1549. Now, I read this a while ago in an article about her, and the words are very moving. This is Calvin speaking about his wife. "I've been bereaved of the best friend of my life, of one who, if it has been so ordained, would willingly have shared not only my poverty, but also my death. During her life, she was a faithful helper of my ministry." The loss of his wife was not the only hard thing that Calvin had to cope with. For many years, he had lots of trouble from some of the so-called libertines. That's the name that was used of them. People in Geneva who were opposed to his strict rules of conduct. They believed that you came into the Christian faith by grace. It was all God. He saved you. It was not about what we did. But once you were saved, you could live just as you liked. Things got so bad, in fact, that in 1553, Calvin asked for permission to resign. But the city council would not let him. It was at this time that the controversy with Servetus happened. Servetus was a medical doctor who had been chased out of various cities in Europe for his heretical views, particularly writings and speaking on the Trinity and rejecting that. And when he arrived in Geneva and he was arrested and then tried as a heretic, and the court found him guilty, and then he was executed for his heresies. Now, many think that this was a low point in Calvin's ministry in Geneva. Actually, though, he was not the one who made the decision. It was the city council, after they conferred with others as well. At the end of that trial, though, Calvin was declared as a true defender of the faith of Christianity and was back in favour, even with his old enemies for a while, the libertines. But things got bad again, and then for 2 years there was real opposition to Calvin and the reforms in the church. And in 1555, everything came to a head. The leaders of the movement were forced to run from the city, and others who were involved in the movement were rounded up and then found guilty and executed. After that time, things were much easier for Calvin, but he was involved in lots of discussions and debates about the nature of Christianity. Calvin had some contact by letter with Martin Luther. Luther, of course, was older than Calvin, and while they certainly respected each other, I think that's right to say that, they disagreed on a number of things, particularly on the Lord's Supper. Luther rejected Calvin's views, and so they didn't see eye to eye on everything. During those latter years, Calvin also sent more than 100 ministers, missionaries, pastors into France, his home country, to take the gospel, to revive the church. He was very much thinking beyond the borders of where he lived. And at the end of his life, although he was ill for a number of years, he continued to preach, to work on the institutes, really felt a passion to get that revised again. And it expanded to 4 books, 80 chapters. And then in 1564, at the age of only 54, he died.